Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm looking at another video from World Video Bible School, home of the bouncy apologists with southern accents. In this video, they suggest that atheism is contradictory at best, which kinda makes me think that they don't understand what atheism even is. Really, what it comes down to is that atheists are people who do not believe in God. Sure, you can divide this up into two subcategories, people who don't accept the God claims that they have heard, and people who positively assert that there is no God. But that's it. It just speaks to their opinion of the God proposition. Any position that is not about the existence of a God is not inherently atheistic or non-atheistic, though certainly being an atheist will tend to predispose you towards certain other positions, like an acceptance of evolution. I have known the occasional atheist that denies evolution, but the vast majority of them do accept evolution, because there's really no reason not to once you remove religion from the equation. So I'm interested to find out what exactly is contradictory about being unconvinced by your God claim.
Why do people generally think that some actions are right and some actions are wrong?
Evolution. Humans are a social species. Being social is a trait with survival advantages. If you work together and share resources, then collectively you can do better than a single organism that needs the same resources but works alone. Early humans were hunter-gatherers. Just think of the name, hunter-gatherer. Some people would hunt, some people would gather. If the hunt was unsuccessful, the gatherers could share the resources they gathered, and vice versa. When both are successful, there are enough resources that some members of the community can spend their time not doing either, and could hone their skills like weapon making, shelter building, and whatnot. Being social helped us survive. As a social species, it works best if everyone plays by certain social rules. If one member of the society kills another for their share of the resources, that does not help the society, that only helps that individual member. So societies that would ostracize members for such behavior did better than ones that would let that kind of behavior run rampant. And so, over time, we developed a general sense of right and wrong that was fueled mostly by empathy. We can imagine ourselves in other people's positions, and we can think of what it would feel like to be in their position, and more than that, we actually feel some of what they feel when we see them in that position. So, long story short, humans developed empathy as a survival trait during their evolutionary history.
Regardless of their subjective opinions?
Well, not everyone can agree on what actions are right or wrong for a lot of situations, but yeah, we can agree on some specific morals, like murder is wrong. But what about something a bit more nebulous, like, say, self-promotion? Nobody likes a braggart who won't shut up about their accomplishments, but on the flip side, being too quiet about your accomplishments can be detrimental. For instance, I once worked at a restaurant that was so poorly managed that I essentially became the unofficial front-of-house manager by virtue of the fact that I would just do what needed to be done that other people weren't doing. By the end of my time there, I was managing the point-of-sale system, ordering stock for the bar, scheduling the staff, running the reservation system, and more. But I just did it. I didn't talk myself up to management ever, and as a result, the upper management that wasn't in the restaurant on a daily basis somehow ended up thinking that I was lazy and ended up firing me while I was on vacation. So in that situation, a little bit of bragging might have saved my job. Though, to be honest, it was such a bad place to work that I was fully planning on finding another job when I got back from the vacation, so being fired wasn't exactly a disappointment. I think I won in the end, though. Just after they fired me, I got a call from the company that I had set up the web-based reservation system with, telling me that they were changing their URLs, and so I'd have to update all the URLs and login credentials in order to continue using it. So since they took that system for granted at the time, nobody thought to ask me for the credentials, so I imagine there was quite a shock when one day it just stopped working without warning. Was it wrong of me to not phone them and tell them to update their information? Maybe, but most people would also say that it was wrong of them to fire me while I was on vacation. Is tit for tat right or wrong? Depends on who you ask. I know people who would say I should have done the right thing and called them to let them know of their upcoming technical problem, but I also know several other people who would agree that me letting their reservations crash and burn was the right thing to do. At the end of the day, morality is a much more complicated topic than just this list of things are morally right and this list of things are morally wrong. Sure, there are a few items that you could list that the vast majority of people would agree with, but usually those are things that won't really impact our day-to-day lives, like murder. Just looking at murder pragmatically, even if it were legal, in most cases it would be more trouble than it's worth. So even if I wanted to, I probably wouldn't, just to avoid the hassle, so I would still go through my life without murdering people, even if I didn't wouldn't consider it a moral wrong. So a moral debate about murder would be largely pointless because it would have little impact on my day-to-day life. The moral questions that actually do have a day-to-day impact on people's lives are much more nuanced and not as obviously right or wrong.
Why do most people generally believe that it's unfair for a known cheater to win a race at the Olympics?
See? There you go, starting off big. And I'll bet this is the smallest immoral action that you deal with in this video. Our dislike of cheating probably also comes from evolution. Cheaters are those who don't follow the rules that are laid out, so if everyone in the hunting and gathering tribe is sharing their resources, the guy who squirrels away a double ration of resources is putting the rest of the tribe at risk, so we don't like him. Sure, cheating at a race doesn't actually hurt anyone, but it's a person breaking the rules that have been laid out, so we don't like it. But what about my situation earlier? If we go by what the Bible says, with the whole turn the other cheek, if someone sues you for your tunic, give them your cloak thing, then what I should have done was immediately call the restaurant and offer to set the system up on the new URLs for free, as well as turning over the login credentials so that they could manage the system themselves. But here's the thing, very few people that I have told the story to have ever said that I did the wrong thing. It's almost always been the opinion that if the restaurant had a better appreciation for my work, they wouldn't have fired me, and the way they fired me was so sleazy that I was perfectly justified in not volunteering the login credentials, which I absolutely would have turned over had they asked. So I did the wrong thing according to the Bible, but most people agree that I did the right thing, meaning that the innate morality that is written on our hearts disagrees with the morality found in the Bible, which can either mean that the Bible is wrong on certain moral issues, or that morality is not actually innately written on our hearts and can rather be influenced by things like upbringing and culture.
Why do most people believe it's evil or wicked for an adult to torture an innocent child simply for the fun of it?
Our protective instincts toward children are probably the easiest part of our morality to justify using evolution. Obviously, if we want our genes to survive, protecting the next iteration of our genes is a good strategy.
Or for a man to force himself sexually upon a woman?
That's actually a fairly recent development in morality. Historically speaking, women were usually treated as a sort of property. Sure, they usually had more rights than slaves, but only just. So rape was a property crime. If the woman was yours, then her desire is irrelevant. You can use her as you see fit. It's only when the woman is someone else's property that it's a problem. And you can see this reflected in the Bible. If you rape a woman who is married, that's when you get punished. If she is unmarried, then you have decreased her value to her father, so you have to pay him, and then you marry the woman. You break it, you buy it. It was only when we started recognizing women's rights that the idea of rape within a marriage even became a point to discuss. And even today, religious organizations can often be seen arguing that marital rape is impossible because the I do on the wedding day counts as a blanket consent statement for the whole marriage. And I'm not sure what the official World Video Bible School's position is, but it's usually religious organizations that have very similar leanings to them. You know, right-wing, anti-evolution, anti-science, believes in the inerrancy of the Bible, that sort of group. If you believe a book that describes women as property is inerrant, it's not hard to get to the marital rape is impossible position from there. But at any rate, because this is a recent moral development, that means that our morality as a society can change, which is another point against the idea that all morals are written on our hearts.
Why do people generally think that such actions are outright wrong?
Better question, why do you have to use the word generally there if we get our morals from God? The usual argument is that we can all agree on certain things being right or wrong, and this is evidence that there is some supernatural force that designed us to feel that these certain things are right and wrong. But that would mean that we would all have to actually agree on morality, which would mean that you wouldn't need to use the word generally. Your phrasing has defeated the fundamental premise of your argument, as you recognize that even the most universally agreed upon moral is not 100% universally agreed upon.
Because most people, even many atheists, know that real, objective good and evil exist.
Why just most people? Shouldn't it be all people if God wrote his moral code on our hearts? And if he hasn't written his moral code on everyone's hearts, why does he skip some people? Why does antisocial personality disorder exist? Like, sure, the fall, we're all imperfect now, but would have been perfect if not for the fall. But if that's the explanation for why not everyone agrees on morality, then why even is there a general agreement on morality? Why would God choose to continue making most people with a moral code, but then skip some? Or is it outside of God's hands now? In which case, wouldn't it then only be the Christians with God's moral code? Why would atheists and people of non-Christian religions share a similar moral code if the fall made it so that we need to turn to the Christian God for our morality? This argument has so many holes in it that it might just be less seaworthy than Noah's Ark.
Although objective morality may be outside the realm of the scientific method, every rational person can know that some things are innately good while other things are innately evil.
Yeah, if we just go by how we feel, there are some things that have been programmed into us by evolution to feel wrong for most people. But I prefer to put thought into my moral system. And I agree, morality can be objective if we can agree on a goal. If the goal is human well-being, then we can look at any given action and morally evaluate it based on whether it increases or decreases human well-being, and boom, we can now objectively determine if any action is moral or immoral. Now, sure, it's not perfect. Evaluating decisions after the fact is much easier than accurately predicting the consequences of your actions, but it's something.
Atheist Michael Ruse admitted in his book Darwinism Defended that the man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says that 2 + 2 = 5.
Yeah, because it is a demonstrable fact that the pain and suffering caused by the action of raping a child is greater than the momentary pleasure that might be felt by the rapist. Significantly greater. Using human well-being as the measuring stick, we can objectively determine this and agree. But it's also worth mentioning that not all atheists hold to the same moral philosophy. There are some who would disagree with me on this issue and would say that it's not objective, it's just that evolution has programmed us to want to protect children, so the fact that most of us feel very strongly that it is wrong is an accident of nature. And then there are some who would find my system of determining objective right and wrong to be too weak. There are some things that are universally wrong, and you don't need to agree on a goal first to determine that. And these people might be put off by my mathematical measuring of harm versus benefit in such a morally atrocious situation. My point is that you are speaking about atheists as if they are a homogeneous group who would all agree with what Michael Ruse said there, which they aren't. Moral philosophy and atheism are not linked, though certainly it is easier to argue against objective morality if you don't have a book telling you that there is one universal law regarding what is right and what is wrong, giving the atheist more freedom to carefully consider their morality rather than just relying on gut feelings.
Philosophers Francis Beckwith and Gregory Kukul said it well. Those who deny obvious moral rules, who say that murder and rape are morally benign, that cruelty is not a vice, and that cowardice is a virtue?
I'm not sure if it matters what they say after that statement, because it's pretty clear by the opening line there that they are setting up a straw man. I have never seen anyone argue that murder or rape are morally benign, or claim that cruelty is not a vice, or that cowardice is a virtue. The closest I've seen is just a description of how cowardice is a trait that still survives in the population. The coward who ran from the battle had a better chance of living than the brave person who stayed and fought. And since war is historically something that would have had its largest impact on the population of young men of breeding age, it stands to reason that many of the bravest soldiers throughout history died in battle before having children. So that's a trait that, evolutionarily speaking, needs a balance. Some cowards will survive to propagate the genes while brave men defend them, but you still need brave people to do the defending in times of war. But that is not saying that cowardice is a virtue, it's just explaining how it is a trait that has survived in the population.
Do not merely have a different moral point of view, they have something wrong with them.
Sure, but if such people exist, and that's a big if, is that not itself a demonstration that morality is not universally imprinted on us as a species? But as I mentioned, most moral decisions that people make are not quite as drastic as the examples that apologists like to bring up. When you get to more nuanced moral questions that people actually face in their everyday life, it is much less black and white. At the job that I described earlier, had I not been fired, I was planning on quitting. What would be the moral thing to do? Put another job offer at risk because I can't start working until I give notice but they need someone now? Or to just walk off the job for the new, better job? I can tell you, by the way the place treated their employees, walk-offs were a regular problem. My first week working there, and it should have been a warning sign to me, but on a night shift in their peak season, before I had even been officially trained, I was the only server working in the dining room because everyone else that was scheduled for that shift quit by not showing up. Now, I made really good money that night because people tip extra when they see you getting shafted by a situation that you have no control over, but even though I made good money, it is a night that I remember as one of the worst shifts I have ever worked. If I leave without getting notice, I am potentially doing that to someone else. But then, should I put myself through the pains of working for 2 weeks at a place that isn't good to its staff at the best of times, but now they know I'm leaving, so will be worse? That's a moral dilemma. I've discussed this with several people, and the opinion is generally pretty split between giving notice for the sake of the other employees and just leaving because I don't owe such a bad employer the courtesy of giving notice. Also, side note, if you have really bad service at a restaurant, making a scene is a really good way to ensure that that server makes extra money. The tables that see you make a scene will feel bad and tip extra, and any service issues they experience are likely to be attributed to the server being flustered because of the bad customer. So as annoying as the scene makers are, I actually generally considered them a net benefit. One of my best nights was when my manager told me not to serve alcohol to a table that came in drunk. I got to pass the decision off as the manager's. It's not coming from me, it's coming from him. Then they made a drunken scene and stormed off. They were only there for a couple minutes, and every table that was there to see it tipped extra because they felt bad and they appreciated how I kept my cool. Is my appreciating the occasional horrible table that makes a scene immoral? Should I feel bad like I'm taking advantage of people's kindness? I mean, I genuinely appreciate the kindness when it happens, but the fact that I can be so blasé about the whole thing makes it feel like I'm taking advantage. And you know what? I can pretty much guarantee that I will get comments on this video both of solidarity saying they feel the same way, and of critics who agree that I'm unfairly taking advantage and should turn down any extra tips that result from these situations. But that's my point. When discussing the little moral situations that people deal with on a regular basis, opinion is often split and can change depending on how many details you know about the situation. If you just heard that I walked off a job without giving notice, just with that information alone, it seems wrong. Of course you should give notice, that's just inconsiderate. But when you hear that the management there not only enforced a policy of servers paying a tip out to the owners of the restaurant, which is itself illegal, they also illegally skimmed from the tips that were supposed to go on paychecks, they ignored labor laws that require a minimum of 6 hours between shifts, so you could expect sometimes to finish work at 3 a.m. and then have to be back to open at 6 a.m. for breakfast, not to mention the verbal abuse and unrealistic expectations, then it becomes understandable why someone would quit working without giving notice. But then if we look at all these things that I am saying the business did wrong individually, some of them could appear to be justified. As far as skimming tips is concerned, I have seen people argue that even though it's illegal, it shouldn't be. The management are working hard to operate a restaurant. Restaurants have a famously small profit margin, so of course the staff should be willing to contribute to that profit margin. And it was a small establishment with minimal staff, so if there's a wedding one night that requires all hands on deck, someone needs to be back at 6 to open the restaurant, even if labor laws require more time between shifts. And if you search the comments section, you will probably find people defending both me and the restaurant, though my money's on more people defending me because obviously I've presented the situation with my bias. But the point is that morality isn't as obvious as apologists would have you believe when it comes to everyday decisions like these. It's only obvious to everyone for the big ticket items that the majority people will never actually deal with in their lives.
Most rational people do not merely feel like rape and child abuse may be wrong. They are wrong, innately wrong.
So are you saying that the Bible is innately wrong when it says that whoever spares the rod hates his son? Because that is unquestionably talking about not just hitting your kids, but beating them with a rod. Like, that's past the grounds covered by the debate about whether spanking is an acceptable form of discipline or abuse. It's talking about a full-on beating with a weapon, known today as child abuse. As I pointed out, the idea that rape is wrong is a fairly new idea in society, and some aspects of it are still being debated, like marital rape, with the more literal-minded religious people coming down on the side of marital rape being okay. So clearly that isn't an innate moral either. These two examples that you are using of innate morals that everyone agrees are wrong are two practices that Bible-believing Christians, at least some of them, are actively defending even today. And then again, if there is a debate about whether or not these obviously immoral actions are actually immoral, what about the smaller things? What about something as harmless as a man wearing clothes that are typically thought of as women's clothes? I'm not even talking about transgender people here. I'm just talking about a man who identifies as a man putting on a dress. It's completely harmless. It's just a bit of cloth. What does it matter how the cloth that you cover yourself with is shaped? Well, again, you have religious people trying hard to put a stop to it because they think it's wrong and perverted. Hell, you don't even have to go as far as overtly dressing in women's clothes. I let my daughter paint my toenails not all that long ago. When I told people at work about it, the majority of them thought it was cute, and that I was being a good dad for letting her do that. But then I told the one guy who is the right-wing religious guy of the restaurant, and he flipped his shit and refused to go near me for the rest of the shift, because guys don't wear nail polish. There must be something wrong with me for having let my daughter do my nails. Speaking of which, since the restaurant is closed for now, my daughter finally got to do my fingernails. The restaurant I work at doesn't even let women wear nail polish aside from the clear coat, so I've always had to tell her no, but now I have red fingernails for Canada Day. Is that morally wrong? There are some who would say yes, it is wrong, others would not. What is the objective standard by which we measure that particular action? If we use my increase well-being goal, I have harmed no one, and I have made my daughter happy, so it has done zero harm to anyone, and has provided some benefit to my daughter, making it a moral action. But there are people who would call me a pervert for having painted nails.
Just as 2 plus 2 can really be known to be 4, every rational human can know that some things are objectively good while other things are objectively evil.
But how did you determine those things to be objectively good or evil? Because certainly child abuse is not condemned in the Bible, it's rather encouraged. And the only time the Bible ever talks about rape, it's essentially a property crime. The 3 rape scenarios that are discussed in the Bible have the woman being punished for it in 2 out of 3 of the scenarios. If she is married and it happens in town, she gets executed. If she's not married, she's forced to marry her rapist in a you broke it, you bought it style transaction. The only time she's not punished is if it happens outside of town and she is married. The assumption being that in town, if she weren't into it, she would have cried for help. So obviously she was into it, and cheating on your husband is a capital offense. Outside of town, though, if she called for help, nobody would have heard her scream, so that one she can't be faulted for. So you certainly didn't get these moral ideas from the Bible.
However, reason demands that objective good and evil can only exist if there is some real objective point of reference.
Yep. The objective point of reference that I have proposed is the goal of increasing human well-being.
If something such as child abuse can be legitimately criticized as morally wrong, then there must be an objective standard, some higher law which transcends space and time.
How does that follow? You said there needs to be an objective standard by which we can measure an action to determine its morality, and I would agree with that. But something does not need to transcend space and time in order to be considered objective. And having it as some kind of law is actually rather unhelpful. A law would not be able to account for all the variability that can be found in individual human situations. I know you favor biblical law. Well, where in the Bible does it say anything about me painting my fingernails to make my daughter happy? The closest the Bible comes to saying anything about this is Deuteronomy 22:5, where it says, "A woman shall not wear a man's garment, nor shall a man put on a woman's cloak, for whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord your God." It says nothing of makeup, nail polish, or jewelry. And really, what is a man's garment or a woman's cloak? Are pants a male or female thing? What about a t-shirt? Socks? Footwear? What about in ancient Greece, where clothing was literally just a piece of cloth that was generally roughly rectangular in shape, that you just draped around yourself and was largely interchangeable between men and women? Were they living in sin because of the fabric they covered themselves with? Does this passage take into account the changing style over time and culture, or are women supposed to dress the same as 7th century BCE Hebrew women dressed, and same with men? And Jesus is usually depicted as wearing a robe that is open at the bottom, which today we refer to as a dress, and it's usually thought of as women's clothing. Does this mean that men can wear dresses since Jesus did? Your perfect, transcendent, timeless moral law leaves quite a lot of questions unanswered.
Recognition by atheists of anything being morally wrong begs the question, how can an atheist logically call something atrocious, deplorable, evil, or wicked?
Depends on the atheist. In my case, it's because we can measure an action based on how it affects well-being. If it has a massive negative effect, then I can freely refer to that thing as atrocious, deplorable, evil, or wicked, though I usually avoid evil and wicked because of the religious connotations that are usually carried with those words, but I could use them if I wanted to.
According to atheism, man is nothing but matter in motion.
No, according to atheism, God doesn't exist. That is the only statement that can be made according to atheism. And you'll still find atheists arguing over the way I phrased that statement, with some arguing that I should have instead said, according to atheism, atheists are unconvinced by your God claim. I've mentioned it before, but it's a great example, so I'll keep bringing it up whenever it's relevant, but I once knew a lady who called herself an atheist, and she believed that humans are a representation of transdimensional immortal beings who insert themselves into human life, erasing their knowledge of their transdimensional life, as a form of entertainment. She didn't believe in a god or gods, and she would disagree with your statement that man is nothing but matter and motion. Just remember, anytime you hear anyone say anything about what atheism says or teaches, unless what they claim it says or teaches is just a variation on the statement there are no gods, they are wrong.
Humankind allegedly evolved from rocks and slime over billions of years.
Nope. Nobody thinks we evolved from rocks. And maybe the first organisms would have been slimy, I don't know, but that's just using a word with a negative connotation to evoke a negative feeling for your audience to associate with atheism. And it's evolution that says that, not atheism. I can introduce you right now to several Christians that I know personally who accept evolution. If evolution is a teaching of atheism, how would Bible-believing Christians ever come to accept it?
But whoever speaks of wrong rocks, moral minerals, or corrupt chemicals?
Nobody, really, because rocks and minerals don't actually do anything. Chemicals, though, we basically are bags of chemicals. Everything is made of chemicals, so if a person is corrupt, that is a corrupt bag of chemicals. Even if you believe there is more to a human being than the chemicals that they're made from, they are still made from chemicals, so that corrupt human being is still a corrupt bag of chemicals. Like, you are literally mostly made out of just oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. These chemicals are so commonplace that all of them are just floating around in the atmosphere.
People don't talk about morally depraved donkeys, evil elephants, or immoral monkeys.
Generally, no, because we recognize that our cognitive abilities are much more complex than most animals, so we recognize that other animals are not thinking about the morality of their actions, they're just acting out behaviors. That being said, rudimentary moral systems can be seen throughout the animal kingdom, and fun fact, how closely related to human beings an animal is a fairly good predictor of how complex its moral system will be.
Dogs are not depraved for stealing the bone of another dog.
I mean, it makes sense that we think about morality in human terms because, we are human. We also have the cognitive ability to recognize that dogs are unable to analyze situations in the complex way that humans can. In other words, we recognize that a dog stealing another dog's bone does not know that stealing is wrong, unless it is trained to not steal through the typical dog training of reward and punishment, in which case, it's still not making a moral judgment, it just knows that not stealing sometimes comes with a reward, and stealing always comes with a punishment.
Pigs are not punished for being immoral when they eat their young.
Do pigs eat their young? I hadn't heard that one before. Well, after some reading, it turns out that pigs that are confined while farrowing, or having babies, have a much higher chance of attacking their piglets. It's also much more common for pigs that have never farrowed before. Which I find interesting because as an amateur fish keeper, I am quite familiar with the idea of parents eating their babies. In the case of fish, it's usually because the fish just don't have the mental capacity to know better, they just eat anything that fits in their mouths. But there are some species of fish, like angelfish, that, as it turns out, are like pigs, in that they are more likely to eat their young if they have never had young before. Not attacking their young is a learned behavior that they develop over time and after reproducing multiple times. But that's off topic. For pigs, it seems much more likely to happen when they are removed from an environment that could be considered to be closer to their natural environment. So that seems more like a development that comes as the result of factory farming rather than a behavior that they would have had in the wild. Humans do have quite the tendency to screw up animals that we keep for food. Which actually brings up another point. I know there are some people in my audience who will object to my using human well-being as the objective measuring stick for morality and would argue that general well-being, including the well-being of animals, should be included in that. And I'm not really inclined to disagree with that assessment, but so far we've only been talking about humans, so it wasn't really relevant up until now.
Male animals are not tried for rape if they appear to force themselves upon female animals.
Well, it's debatable whether or not animals that engage in forced sexual behavior for reproduction even have the cognitive capacity to give consent. Therefore, it is debatable whether the term rape would even apply there.
The fact that humans even contemplate morality testifies to the huge chasm between man and animals.
Except it's not so much a chasm as a spectrum. We are on the end of the spectrum that has more complex social structures and more developed cognitive abilities, and the animals that are most closely related to us, evolutionarily speaking, are also closer to us on this morality and cognitive ability spectrum.
Simply put, The moral argument states, if objective moral values exist, then God exists.
That is a flawed premise. If objective moral values exist, then that just means that objective moral values exist, nothing more. If the moral values are truly objective, then even if a God exists, it isn't the source of those moral values. Its morality can line up with those values, sure, but if they are truly objective, then they don't come from God, but apply to God. If they come from God, then they are subjective, with God being the subject.
Objective moral values such as good and evil, justice and injustice do exist.
But only if we first agree upon a goal by which to measure actions. And the goal has changed over time. Not all societies have shared the same goal. As such, different societies have had different opinions on morality, which can then be used to argue that objective morals don't exist.
Therefore, God exists.
Well, premise 1 is just an unsubstantiated assertion. Premise 2 is debatable at best. So if the argument goes from an assertion to a premise that has not been demonstrated to actually be true to a conclusion, then can you really trust that this conclusion is true?
The moral argument for God's existence exposes atheism as either self-contradictory or outright appalling.
How so? Because atheists are willing to think through the premises of the argument rather than just blindly accepting them because the religion requires it?
You see, the atheist must either reject the accuracy of the moral argument's first premise,
and I do,
and illogically accept the indefensible idea that objective morality somehow arose from rocks and reptiles.
Objective just means that it's not subject to opinion. Outside of an agreed-upon goal, I really don't think that objective morality does exist. And the book that you believe came from the source of objective morality can be shown to promote a morality that many today consider immoral. So that fact kinda undercuts your whole argument. If morality is truly objective, not my weak sauce, if we agree on a goal we can objectively measure actions against that goal objective, but truly objective, then that means that morality shouldn't change, which would mean that all the heinous immoral acts that are described as being moral by the Bible should still be moral. You said this argument exposes atheism as being appalling. Well, I am appalled by the moral code laid out in the Bible. If that truly is the Christian source of morality, then that exposes Christianity as being appalling.
Or he must reject the argument's second premise.
I kinda reject that one too. Like I said, the version of objective morality that I have described here is a rather weak sauce version of objective morality. But the thing is, morality is something that only applies to organisms that are cognitively able to conceive of morality. So if you remove these organisms from the equation, morality ceases to exist. Can something really be truly objective if its existence is dependent on a certain subject, namely the organisms that are able to conceive of morality? Even if God is the ultimate source of morality, that means that morality is dependent on the existence of God, a being who is cognitively able to conceive of morality. If you take him out of the equation, along with all the other moral beings, morality ceases to exist, making it dependent on the subjects of morality. In other words, making it subjective. That's it for today. I got a postcard in my P.O. box this week from Tom, showing me a lovely picture of the area he grew up in Menominee, Wisconsin. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Matt Bell, who says, "Biblical analysis through the lens of Iron Man movies? Oh yeah!" This was on my interview with Dr. Josh of Digital Hammurabi. It was a fun interview, and if you haven't seen it yet, I'd recommend giving it a watch. Yeah, if you're not interested in the topic, it can be a bit dry, but at one point we did talk about how the biblical authors would not necessarily have been worried about contradiction. They would have been more concerned with a compelling narrative, and we used the Iron Man trilogy as a comparison. It is an obvious contradiction that I'm sure some of the writers noticed that the Iron Man suit is basically indestructible in the first movie, but by movie 3, they explode when they crash into empty shipping containers, or just fall apart completely with a slight bump into something. The writers weren't concerned with the contradiction, they just wanted to tell a compelling story, which, to be fair, in my opinion, Iron Man 3 was not really a compelling story, but they tried. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, especially Mark McManus, who are the objective standard by which my morality is measured. If you'd like to stop me from becoming an immoral monster, you can support the channel for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. Other ways to support the channel, such as direct donation or my Amazon wishlist, are linked in the description, as well as my social media accounts and my P.O. Box address. See you next time!